Something about this war has been bothering me for weeks.
Not the missiles, not the oil prices, not even the closed strait. Something quieter than all of that. Think about it for a second. The world's second largest economy, silent. The world's largest country by population, silent. A nation that spent decades building relationships across the Middle East, silent. Countries that signed formal military alliances with Iran just months ago, silent. War broke out, people died. A supreme leader was killed. An entire shipping lane that carries 20% of the world's oil supply was shut down. And the three most powerful countries that were supposed to be Iran's closest partners, Russia, China, and India, responded with the diplomatic equivalent of a shoulder shrug. We urge restraint. We call for peace. We are closely monitoring the situation. That's it. That's all. Now, if your first instinct is to call that cowardice or weakness, I completely understand. I thought the same thing. But after weeks of going through the intelligence reports, the economic analyses, the leaked diplomatic documents, and the expert assessments, I realize we've been reading this completely wrong. This silence isn't weakness. It's a strategy, a cold, calculated, highly sophisticated strategy. And once you understand what each of these countries is actually doing beneath the surface of that silence, you'll never look at this war the same way again. Let me walk you through it country by country, layer by layer, because the full picture is genuinely more shocking than any headline you've seen so far. And before we go any deeper, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is not finished. And when the next layer breaks, you want to be here for it. Let's start with the country whose silence makes the least sense on the surface: Russia. Russia and Iran just signed a 20-year comprehensive strategic partnership treaty in January 2025. That's not old history. That's 13 months ago. The two countries had defense coordination clauses, intelligence sharing provisions, and explicit mutual support language baked into that agreement. And then February 28th happened. US and Israeli strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, his wife, his mother, his son, an entire family wiped out in one night. Iran's nuclear facilities were destroyed. Its missile infrastructure was shattered. The country that Russia called its most important Middle Eastern partner was being bombed into rubble. And Putin's response, a formal condemnation, some statements about sovereignty, and then almost nothing. The world expected Russia to act, to supply weapons, to escalate, to do something dramatic that matched the scale of what was happening to its so-called ally. Instead, Russia watched. Now, here's the question you have to ask. Is Putin stupid? Weak? Did he suddenly forget about that 20-year partnership? No. From Russia's point of view, silence is the best way to let Washington entangle itself in a protracted war in the Middle East, opening space to expand Putin's influence in Europe and giving Russia room to maneuver in Ukraine without American attention. PIIE. According to a report by the KSE Institute, Russia could receive as much as $45 to $151 billion in additional budget revenues in 2026, depending on the conflict's duration. In the central scenario of a 3-month war, the windfall reaches $161 billion in additional export revenues, roughly $500 million a day, more than Russia's entire 2025 fiscal deficit. PIIE. Read that again slowly. Every single day this war continues, Russia is making $500 million in additional revenue from elevated oil prices. $500 million per day. That is not a side effect. That is a financial lifeline for a country bleeding money in Ukraine. And here's the part that makes Russia's silence not just strategic, but actually restraint should not be confused with inaction. Russia has been providing Iran with satellite imagery on the locations and movements of American troops, ships, and aircraft. Russia also likely advised Iran on drone tactics. According to US and European officials, Russia is sending upgraded drones to Iran. The involvement of Russia prolonged Iran's resistance by improving its situational awareness. So Russia isn't actually it's just doing it quietly. It's giving Iran just enough support to keep the war going, keeping oil prices elevated, keeping America distracted. without triggering direct US retaliation against Russia itself. This is the most cynical geopolitical calculation happening in the world right now. Russia is literally profiting off its allies' suffering. It keeps the war burning just hot enough to keep the money flowing, and it keeps its hands just clean enough to maintain deniability. Russia is the primary beneficiary of war-induced price spikes. Current projections suggest the Kremlin could see a budget surplus of over $150 billion in 2026, effectively subsidizing its own regional objectives. They are funding their Ukraine war with money made from Iran's destruction. That is where we are. Now let's talk about China. And this one is where it gets genuinely jaw-dropping. China had a 25-year, $400 billion strategic partnership with Iran signed in 2021. It gets 13% of its oil from Iran at discounted prices. It voted alongside Russia at the UN to condemn the strikes. It said all the right things publicly. And then it did nothing. No weapons, no military intervention. No real pressure on Washington. Iranian officials expressed what sources described to Al Jazeera as a degree of frustration with Beijing's inaction. And you can understand why. If your most powerful partner watches you get bombed while saying they're concerned, that's a betrayal dressed up in diplomatic language. But here's what China is actually doing, and it's the most chilling part of this entire story. Former CIA and National Security Council official Dennis Wilder said directly, the Chinese military is going to go to school on this. The People's Liberation Army is studying the Pentagon's tactics and strategy in the Iran war, with an eye to any eventual Washington-Beijing conflict over Taiwan. South China Morning Post, let that sink in. China is using this war as a free intelligence operation. It's watching how American aircraft carriers move. It's watching how missile defense systems respond. It's watching how the US coordinates strikes, manages logistics, handles naval operations in a contested environment. Observing US naval operations in the Gulf, in real time, carrier movements, missile intercept patterns, logistics flows, is itself strategically valuable for China as it thinks through scenarios involving the Strait of Taiwan. The more the US deploys and reveals its operational playbook and weaknesses in the Gulf, the better calibrated Beijing's own planning for a military takeover of Taiwan becomes. But China isn't just watching passively. Research published in March 2026 argues that Iran functions as an indirect proxy, allowing China to study, counter, and prepare for US military power without direct confrontation, particularly in anticipation of future conflicts in Taiwan and the South China Sea. China uses the battlefield to study the performance of Western weapon systems, radar signatures, and operational networks, enabling analysis, reverse engineering, and AI integration into its own systems. Asia Times, and there's more. Private Chinese technology companies, some with ties to the military, are marketing detailed intelligence on movements of US forces in Iran, even as Beijing seeks to keep its distance. The Washington Post, a growing body of evidence indicates that China has significantly contributed intelligence support, satellite navigation, radar systems, and electronic warfare technologies that augment Iran's targeting capabilities. Small Wars Journal. So what is China actually doing? It's helping Iran just enough to keep US military systems under stress. It's collecting battlefield data in real time on how America fights a war. It's staying out of the direct line of fire to protect its massive trade relationship with the United States because a Trump XI summit is scheduled, because soybean purchases and Boeing aircraft deals are on the table. Because William Yang of the International Crisis Group put it plainly, Beijing sees no benefit in heightening tension with the US over Iran, and places greater value on trade stability than on expressions of solidarity with Tehran. China is running a masterclass in strategic ambiguity. It's publicly neutral, privately supportive of Iran in limited ways, economically protected from the worst of the oil shock because it stockpiled energy reserves, and using every day of this conflict to study exactly how to defeat the United States if it ever comes to a fight over Taiwan. U.S. reconnaissance sorties in the South China Sea have already fallen by 30% since the war began. Beijing could see this as an opportunity to incrementally intensify its baseline levels of coercion. The diplomat, America is distracted. Taiwan is more exposed than it's been in years, and China is watching, learning, and quietly moving pieces into position. Now, India, and this one is the most complicated and the most painful of the three. India's silence is different from Russia's and China's. Russia's silence is strategic. India's silence is a mistake it's already starting to pay for. Every other BRICS founding member, Russia, China, and Brazil, quickly denounced the war. India alone seemed to be condoning it with silence. Why? Because India was trying to keep everyone happy at the same time, it has a strategic partnership with the United States. It has deepening defense ties with Israel. It has extensive economic interests in the Arab Gulf states. And it calculated that staying quiet would let it maintain all of those relationships without choosing sides. That calculation has already blown up in its face. 90% of India's liquefied petroleum gas imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Following the closure of the strait by Iran, protests erupted across India over LPG shortages. Long queues formed outside fuel and gas distribution centers. Prices spiked dramatically. Restaurants and hotels began burning firewood as a fuel source. Because there was no gas, sales of induction stoves on Amazon increased more than 30-fold. Wikipedia, 30-fold, because people couldn't cook their food in the world's most populous country, because a war that India refused to take a position on disrupted a shipping lane that India's energy supply completely depends on. And it gets worse. If the United States succeeds in effecting regime change in Tehran or significantly degrading its capabilities, the direct consequence would be greater concentration of power in U.S. hands, which militates against the promotion of multipolarity that has been the foundation of India's grand strategy for decades. The diplomat, India spent years building a $1 billion investment in Iran's Chabahar port. It spent years cultivating a relationship with Tehran that was supposed to give India an alternative trade route, bypassing its rivals Pakistan and China. It positioned itself as a bridge between the West and the East, as a country that could talk to everyone. And then when the moment came that required it to use that position, to mediate, to speak, to leverage, it said nothing. The emergence of Pakistan alongside Egypt and Turkey as a primary back-channel interlocutor between Iran and the United States is a stinging strategic setback for New Delhi. Wikipedia, India's rival, the country India has been in strategic competition with for 7 decades. Pakistan is now the country brokering peace talks between the United States and Iran. Think about what that means. India spent years building the relationships, the diplomatic credibility, the geographic position that would make it a natural mediator in exactly this kind of crisis. And it stood on the sideline while its neighbor, with far fewer resources and relationships, walked in and took that role. Great powers shape events. They are consulted before strikes, not after. They can speak to all sides because all sides need to speak to them. India today exhibits none of these attributes. Asia Times, but it's accurate, and it came from Indian analysts themselves. So let's zoom out and ask the question that actually matters. Who is winning this war? Not on the battlefield. In the long game, the answer might genuinely surprise you. The war unexpectedly showed Iran's most important tool is neither its missile program nor its nuclear program, but the ability to close the Strait of Hormuz, which quickly put pressure on the US and its allies. International Crisis Group's Iran project director Ali Vaez stated, in the attempt to try to prevent Iran from developing a weapon of mass destruction, the US handed Iran a weapon of mass disruption. And in doing so, activated a more powerful threat that no military strike can destroy, because you can't bomb a geographic choke point out of existence. The US may currently possess military dominance, but Russia and China are effectively winning the risk war. By encouraging a prolonged state of conflict, they are systematically lowering Western stability scores and waiting for the cumulative economic and political pressure to force a strategic retreat. Multiple sources compared the closure of the strait to the Suez Crisis, suggesting it would similarly result in a strategic failure for the US. And there's one more consequence that almost nobody is talking about. Analysts at Eagle Intelligence Reports argued that the strikes reinforce North Korea's nuclear deterrence calculus, with Pyongyang interpreting the military action against a non-nuclear Iran as strategic validation of its own weapons program as essential to regime survival, and that the conflict would accelerate North Korean nuclear expansion while making denuclearization talks almost unimaginable in the foreseeable future. North Korea is watching this. Every government that was considering giving up its nuclear weapons program is watching this. The message being sent, whether intentionally or not, is that countries with nuclear weapons get bombed, and countries with nuclear weapons do not. The world just got more nuclear. And the silence of the countries that could have pushed back enabled it. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this. The silence of Russia, China, and India in this war is not the story of three countries that were too weak to act. It's the story of three countries that made cold, calculated decisions about where their interests lay and stayed quiet while those calculations played out. Russia is making $500 million a day from elevated oil prices and using this war to fund its fight in Ukraine. China is running a real-time intelligence operation on US military tactics, preparing for a potential future conflict over Taiwan, while protecting its trade relationship with America. India tried to please everyone and ended up with an energy crisis, empty cooking gas cylinders, and its rival Pakistan stealing its diplomatic role. Three different silences, three very different outcomes. And the people paying the real price, the ordinary people in Iran, in the Gulf states, in India, across Europe and Asia, who are paying more for food, more for fuel, more for everything, because powerful countries decided that their silence was worth more than peace. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Which country do you think made the smarter calculation? Russia, China, or India? And who do you think ultimately comes out ahead when this war finally ends? I'm reading every single response. And if this kind of breakdown is useful to you, subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this story is still moving. New layers are still being revealed. And when the next one breaks, I'll be here breaking it down exactly like this.